To build or not to build? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the spirit to suffer the hots and colds of outrageous climates, or to take shelter against the sea of troubles, and by opposing, master them. To live, to explore, all the more. And by the feast to say we begin the adventure in the thousand natural shocks that life is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to encounter. Aye, there's the rub. Do we build booths to our God, or do we travel to his blessed locations? This is the question in which I present it before you today. I've noticed over the past couple of years that there has been a resurgence in what is to the public called Torah observing Christianity. And one of the big aspects of this is people who will go out and instead of celebrating the feast as we do of traveling to different locations, instead they will build a hut in their backyard, very similar to that of the Jews. And I met a man the other day at a different Church of God congregation who, when I asked him where he was going to the feast, that's what he said. He was going to build a hut in his backyard and sit in it for a couple days. And I said, interesting, never heard of that before. So that led me down this journey of studying and figuring out where does this come from and should we be doing it. And so if you'll turn with me today, we're going to start in Leviticus. We're going to start in Leviticus 23. And we're going to go from 30, I'll start in 33, but my reference starts in 34, and we'll go until 44. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, On the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day you shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any work. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord. You shall proclaim these as times as holy convocations for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifices, and drink offerings, each on its proper day. Besides the Lord's Sabbath, besides your gifts, and besides all your vow offerings, besides all your free will offerings, which you will give to the Lord on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of your land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord 7 days. On the first day will be a day of solemn rest. On the 8th day shall be a day of solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of the splendid trees, branches of palm, trees and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days of the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now this is actually the second time in which the Feast of Booths is mentioned, but this is the first time in which we actually have a clear instruction about this. And so I want to look at, very quickly, 3 points that he pulls out of here. 1, you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. Hence the title, Feast of Booths. 2, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. And 3, you shall take from the splendid trees. I'll come back to these points a bit later. And so before I do that, I want to talk about quickly what is tabernacles? What are booths? And so I wanted to look briefly at the Hebrew for this. So the Hebrew word in this passage for booths is sukkah. This is where the Jews get the term Sukkot, the Feast of Sukkot, from. And so this means temporary structure or a shelter. This is also what Jonah used when after he had preached to Nineveh, he went out and he built a booth. Now, I was having a conversation with Aaron Dominguez last night, and he pointed out to me as well that the booth wasn't a sufficient structure for shelter. It was so insufficient, in fact, that God actually gave him a gourd to cover the booth, because the gourd was more sturdy than the booth itself. Now, the other word used for translated tabernacle is mishkan, which is what we see when we say, God shall dwell with men, or God shall tabernacle with men, as some translations have it. Mishkan means residence or dwelling place. This is a more permanent home. This term is translated tent or more permanent structure 139 times. Now, I also pulled up the Greek because I think the Greek also shows a very fascinating contrast to this. is the Greek for tabernacle is skene, and it is often used of a tent or a permanent structure. This is the word that was used when Moses and Elijah appeared with Christ on the Mount of Transfiguration, and the apostles went and they said, "Let us build 3 tents for you," 3 temporary structures. Now, there are many other passages that discuss the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, I can't say many. I think I skipped over that part earlier, but there are 11 scriptures in particular that talk specifically about the Feast of Tabernacles. So we are not given a lot of words to work with, if you will, on how do we celebrate this feast. And so some of it is descriptive as to what happens during the feast. For example, in Deuteronomy 31, it is a time of release for the year of Jubilee. Another time it is, we often quote Zechariah during the feast as the age of the kingdom. But I'm going to jump now to Nehemiah 8:14, because this is the only account where we have the Israelites celebrating the Feast of Booths. And so we're going to start on verse 14, and we're going to go until verse 18. And they found it written in the law of the Lord that the Lord had commanded Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim it and publish it in all their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out to the hills, bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths as it is written. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves, each on his roof, in their courts, in the courts of the house of God, in the square at the water gate, in the square at the gate of Ephraim. And all the assembly of those who had returned from captivity made booths and had lived in them. For from the days of Joshua the son of Nun to that day the people of Israel had not done so. And there was very great rejoicing. Day by day, from the first day to the last day, he read from the book of the law. They kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the rule. So here is the clearest picture we get in the Old Testament of them celebrating the Feast of Booths. And I want to go back to verse 17 and point this out, because this is a note I think that that a lot of people who build the booths often overlook, is that for from the days of Joshua the son of Nun to that day, the people of Israel had not built booths. Anybody have an idea of how long that is? We are looking at between 700 to 900 years. That includes the time of Judges, that includes the time of Solomon, David, all the prophets. Nobody had built booths to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in this way. And yet God still attributes righteousness and the proper keeping of the feast to these men and women. So if they had done that, that begs the question, is building a booth, the true importance behind the feast? So I want to turn now and look at what is the true purpose of the feast from what we get in the law. So the first purpose is to celebrate the harvest. As I mentioned, Leviticus is actually the second time in which the Feast of Tabernacles was referenced in the Old Testament. The first comes from Exodus. It comes from Exodus 23:16, where it is called the Feast of Ingathering, or the Feast of Harvest. And Jesus focuses on this description of the kingdom so much so, I only pulled out one of his parables here, but from Matthew 13:24 through 43, don't have to turn to that, is the parable of the kingdom and the weeds. And I'm actually going to turn to that so I quote that properly. Bear with me a second here. From verse 37, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, the field is the world, the good seed is the sons of the kingdom, the weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. And so the Feast of Ingathering, as we see it painted for Christ as our Passover, this there's a lot of passages in which are associated with the timing of the Feast of Tabernacles that are very rarely linked to that. And John is also the only one in which is the only New Testament reference we have for the feast, direct reference for the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we have to try and line up the other Gospels with the timing of John. And this Gospel here, the account timeline fits within when Christ was in Jerusalem preaching the message. And so this would most likely have been along the lines of when he was preaching during the feast. So another purpose of the feast is remember our temporary state. This is one of the key reasons why when the law was written, that term sukkah was used for booths. It is meant to be a temporary dwelling. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:4-1 that our life is meant that we look forward to the permanent dwelling, that we remember that our mortal life is temporary and that we look for the permanent home upon which God will give us at Christ's return. And the last, enjoy the blessings of God. For Deuteronomy 16:13 and Exodus also speak of taking from the fruit of splendid trees. And Philippians 4:4-7. I'm also going to pull that up real quick. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. And so as we prepare to journey, we travel, we know that we are keeping the meaning of the feast in all its aspects. Whether it's our temporary dwellings, hotels, sometimes actual tents, or resorts, our travels, plane, car, boat, we know that we do this in the honor of our God.